Me to try to give a talk pertaining to a book that I just published this year, which is a book called Rorty, Public Reason and Modernity's Crisis of Critique. Um, I normally don't talk about things that I've already done, so I thought about what to do about it, and I came up with the idea that when I submitted my manuscript to the publishers, um, one of the reviewers asked me to consider adding to my narrative not only the crisis of critique that happens because of, we can call it philosophical reasons, but because of like material and historical reasons. And the book was already finished, so I never really got to do that. But I've always kept thinking about that, and I decided now to try to like integrate the two aspects into a single talk. I thought this was going to be a lot smaller of a task, but now I realize that, although I just have, the minutes that I have to speak, this is a project that will be as long as a book. So it's going to be a bit hard to put it all together within time constraints, but I'll try to do my best. How much time do I have to speak?
You have 45 minutes to 50 minutes.
Okay, let me put it here. Okay, so I'll try to like just summarize in a couple of paragraphs what I'm going to do, and then I'm going to go ahead and do it. When you talk to other people in public, you're talking to other people. We also talk to ourselves a lot. So we have an internal monologue in our heads. But when we talk to other people, we realize that other people are others. And we use rationality, or we claim that we use rationality in order to try to like come into agreement about matters. Um, the question that I'm trying to explore is, what are the limits to the possibilities of rational agreement in the public sphere? And the limits can be found in different places. There are what I will call formal constraints to reason, which is that reason can only give you as much as it can. They're what I call transcendental constraints, which is like the language game, so to speak, of like giving reasons, also has limitations, and they only yield as much as they yield. And then finally, there are material constraints. For example, in a society that is highly unequal, and where the actors and the subjects who are participating in a conversation, let's say, um, find themselves, experiencing very extreme differential, you know, power relationships, that's also going to affect the outcome of this exercise in public reason. So I'm going to try to approach these different areas one after the other. I mean, the idea about the title, which is actually the marketplace versus the market, plays on the idea from like the liberal tradition of like the marketplace of ideas. So in the marketplace of idea, people, free subjects, come together and talk about things by using rationality, and then they try to like find truth. But then there's also the market, which is code word for the economy, code word for like the capitalist system, code word for the systems of information technology that now operate at a global level. And that is actually a different beast that creates different issues. So I'm going to try to like go through these different dimensions. um in 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 Plato's Meno, which is one of Plato's dialogues, there's this scene in that dialogue where Socrates is trying to get a slave boy to engage in a reasoning process to prove a geometric truth. And the geometric proof is that if you want to create a square that is double the area of the square that you are given, the sides of that new square need to be as long as the diagonal of the first square. And then he goes through a series of questions, and the slave boy produces the answer. And this is supposed to be a demonstration not only of the geometric truth, but a demonstration of the fact that within every human being, in this case including a slave boy, um, you have the faculty of reason that will guide you to the truth, and you just have to exercise it properly in order to get there. You know, now that's all very good, um, but the fact is that when you look at the exercise of reason, you actually immediately find that even when it is applied correctly, reason doesn't always lead you to truth, or reason doesn't even prove to you the falsity of something um, with any finality. I'll give you an example. You know, if we prove that it is not true that A equals A, from that we can conclude that A must not be equal to, sorry, if A is equal to A and that's not true, A is equal to B and that's not true, then
Recording in progress.
then the opposite of it, which is that A is not equal to B, then becomes true. It's just a matter of what we call in logic the principle of identity, or the principle of, like, non-contradiction. Um, but once you move away from like super fundamental things like that, you get into a place where argumentation doesn't really lead you to truth in any kind of like univocal and final way. For instance, you know, they're believers in God, and there's been a lot of proofs for the existence of God, or attempts at a proof for the existence of God. A lot of people have come up with like refutations to these proofs for the existence of God. However, a refutation to a proof doesn't really refute the idea that God exists, or the idea that God doesn't exist. What it actually refutes is the argument that you used in order to come up with this proof. So the fact is that even by using reason in an adequate fashion, in a logical fashion, you find yourself a lot of times at a loss to figure out what is the truth of the matter. Furthermore, not only a refutation of an argument doesn't mean a refutation of a view, but a refutation of an argument about a view doesn't prove the veracity of the opposite view. I'll give you an example, which is a very common example. Um, a lot of people believe that if you refute capitalism, whatever that would mean, a refutation of capitalism, that by default, that means that then communism or socialism then becomes kind of like reinforced, which is obviously not true, because the arguments they're going to be using to prove or disprove capitalism only tangentially relate to the veracity of like what they here are calling the opposite view, which is communism or socialism. So there are formal constraints to the exercise of reasons that are pretty strict. And when you start reasoning logically about matters that are connected to beliefs, what you find out is that although you are striving for truth, what reason gives you is a lot less than truth. And there's a bigger and bigger gap as you move away from like the most fundamental axioms of mathematics, for instance, when you deal with things that we call matters of human import. Um, so those are like what I would call like the formal constraints of the exercise of reason. And they apply not only to public reason, but apply to anybody that is reasoning about any matters. Now, out of this, you get different philosophical positions. For instance, Aristotle, in the book The Rhetoric, asked a very important question: why should we use rhetoric? And the question comes out of this idea: if logic can lead us to the truth, and if people understand logical arguments, why is it that we would need rhetoric? Rhetoric seems to be a supplement, an addition that doesn't really do anything beyond the validity of a logical argument. And Aristotle has two answers to this question. One of the answers is that a lot of human beings are not really particularly logical, which basically means that a lot of human beings don't know how to think logically. And if you're interacting with people in a society, that do not think logically because they don't have the capacity to think logically. They don't have the capacity to not only connect ideas in a logical fashion, but evaluate those connections. Then you're going to have to approach them in a different way. In what way? Well, through rhetoric, which is to convince them by using additional features of discourse, like what appeal to emotions, appeal to character, appeal to what you and I would call status. And furthermore, Aristotle goes further and he says that an individual might even have the capacity to think logically and to evaluate logical arguments, but an individual might be highly emotional. So you might have an individual that has a brain that works properly from a logical point of view, but his or her desire for other things that go beyond simply following the dictates of reason might be so overwhelming that no amount of reasoning will get them to follow the dictates of their rationality. And this is an incredible obstacle, of course. So those are two additional reasons why rationality fails. One, the fact that a lot of human beings cannot really think rationally in the way that we are stipulating here. And number two, that a lot of human beings are too emotional to really be guided by the rationality of their own faculties. And so that completes this first module of, like, the obstacles of reason that are of a type of like formal um character. Now, there are additional issues and additional problems, and I'll go into them. For example, there's the idea of like transcendental conditions of rational argumentation, which basically means what are the conditions that need to be in place so that this game of giving reasons and receiving reasons and acknowledging reasons would work adequately. Um, and a lot of times the way that we think about that game is by means of like the image of the marketplace of ideas. Is an idea where different individuals come into this arena and they're all like atomistic, self-centered, you know, um, rational, logical individuals, and they engage in a give and take of reasons. And out of that agonistics of reason, this like battle between different views defended by different arguments, the truth will emerge as a type of like, outcrop of this battle of different ideas defended by different reasons. And the winners are then accepted as the truth of the matter. This idea has a long tradition, but the first person that described it by means of this image was John Milton in like the 17th century in England. Where we get it very, very strongly is in the book by John Stuart Mill called On Liberty, where there's a chapter on truth, where John Stuart Mill says that we need freedom of expression so that ideas can be heard and they can be debated and they can, we can try to attempt to refute them. And out of that public defense of views, the truth will emerge. So his idea is that truth requires liberty in order to be able to prevail, so to speak. And it's one of the strongest arguments that we have for the defense of freedom of expression and freedom of thought, right? And this is what we call the marketplace of ideas. But there's a dark side to the marketplace of ideas, and it is connected to what we could call the issue of power, right? So again, going back to Plato, at the beginning of like Plato's Republic, you get Socrates meeting this other individual, and they decide to go down to the port, which is a commercial port of Athens, and the port is called Piraeus. And they go visit this rich man called Cephalus, and he has a son called Polemarchus, and they go because they are kind of like summoned to go there. So they go and they engage in a conversation about justice. And Cephalus, Polemarchus, and a friend of them's called Trasimarchus end up defending a position that is akin. And the position is that what justice is not something abstract and atemporal and universal, but justice is the advantage of the strongest. And of course, this is an incredibly problematic idea for a philosopher of a Platonic bend, like Plato was, of course, right? Because what it says is that behind reasons, what you have is ultimately, using modern terminology, behind reasons, what you have is actually power, like Foucault would say. You have a network of power. Um, and what this does, if one accepts this view, is that it brings out this idea that the marketplace of idea is it's a distorted mirror of reality. The marketplace of idea is a place where, putatively speaking, we're presenting reasons, but what we are actually doing is jockeying for positions in a game of power. And in a way, it's a type of ritualistic way to do it. And it's a way to do it where you legitimize power relationships by claiming that they are natural because they are the outcrop of something that is something other than power. Now, this suspicion about this state of affairs has been reiterated through the history of philosophy. Of course, we have Marx and his like critique of ideology. We have Nietzsche in his critique of like of morality. And we have other people, but those are like some of like the real important um what we call masters of suspicion, right? And so what this adds is actually a critique to this notion that the transcendental conditions of the exercise of public reason are pure, for lack of a better term. And the idea is that they're not pure because there's always issues of power and power dynamics that get played out by means of reasons. However, we could try to like claim that these are just simply empirical constraints and that we could transcend these empirical constraints, and that we could engage in giving reasons and receiving reasons in a non-distorted way, like Habermas would say, in a type of non-distorted um, communicative situation, discursive situation. Now, we could try to go with that assumption and see where that takes us. Well, one of the places where that takes us is to a place where giving reasons always refers to more fundamental reasons. So if I give you a reason for X, I give you a reason to believe X. You might question my reason to believe X by that premise that I gave you. And I might then provide you yet another reason for that premise. So in a way, it's a type of like, regress argument. And we can go back and back and back. But at some point, we need to stop. Otherwise, we engage in a type of infinite regress, which is which is incredibly problematic. Of course, an infinite regress never really justifies the beliefs because we always need to go back to yet finding another justification for the previous justifications that we just gave you, right? Um, in philosophy, we always stop. And we stop by baptizing, for lack of a better term, these premises of our arguments. And normally, the way the story is told is that we stop when we finally find premises that are self evident, we call them, right? Premises that don't require any further justification. And there are different kinds of appeals. There are appeals to like self-evidence straightforwardly, like you get in Descartes with these ideas of innate ideas. Sometimes the premises are connected to God, or they're connected to ideas, abstract notions of natural law, but they are always connected to big principles that we believe that everybody should accept. But the fact is that a lot of people don't accept those premises when we have fundamental differences, or what we call fundamental differences, which are ultimately the ones that philosophy really cares to think about. Those fundamental differences, what they are really pointing at is at fundamental differences in the fundamental starting points that we're using to build our rational edifice to begin with. Um, So, oddly enough, we find ourselves in a weird situation where it appears to me that if my reasons would convince you, it's because you already believe in those premises within yourself as a matter of like felt experience, so to speak. But if that's the case, you don't really need any arguments because you already are, in a way, on the same page as I am. So the argument is this like extra exercise in giving you a transcript of what you're already thinking at the level of gut feeling. On the other hand, conversely, if you and I disagree about the fundamental principles, no amount of argumentation will get you out of your belief into my belief, because your belief and my belief are based in like non-rational starting points. So oddly enough, if my reasons would work for you, you don't need them. And if my reasons, you know, don't work for you, no amount of reasoning will get you to be convinced of what I'm saying. So then what it leaves us is with a very strange play, in a very strange place where this idea of giving reasons turns out not to be particularly useful. Now, it's useful for a very small subset of people, is people that think like you, but they have not really realized why they think like that. So the reasons what they do is they connect signposts for those people, and they allow them to see where they're coming from, and they tidy it. It's reasons that allow them to tidy up their belief system into a more cohesive system, and also for them to gain a certain level of like self-awareness of where they're standing. Now we could ask the question, well, the people that disagree with us, will they ever agree with us? And the answer is maybe. But the way that they might get to agree with us is not connected to they finding or reading somewhere something that completely like floors them and makes them all of a sudden have a logical epiphany. The way that they might end up agreeing with us is because life happens to them, you see. And when life happens to them, sometimes they get delivered into a different place in the world, so to speak. And by that deliverance, they might end up experiencing the world in a fundamentally different way, which all of a sudden will give resonance to these beliefs that they didn't believe in like 5 years before. And this happens a lot. An individual might have a strong belief in communism, for instance, and then they might participate in a communist experiment, and it might be so wretched that out of that experience of wretchedness, they actually stop being communists. Or an individual might claim that abortion is like immoral and evil until they become pregnant and decide that actually that abortion is the only way forward, although imperfect. And they gain a type of like vantage point of understanding, right? But these are not like rational conversions. These are actually existential conversions, which are never really driven
And
by.
decide that actually that abortion is the only way forward.
Sir, you are muted. Sorry. Unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, thank you.
Okay, so So I was saying that those epiphanies are not of a rational nature. It's not that you sat and you found this master argument that led you to the truth of the matter. You actually went through a life experience that changed like your basic reference points. And now that you have different reference points, you're gonna think differently. But nothing really deep comes out of that, unfortunately, because what comes out of that is actually if you're a totally different person living a totally different life, you're probably going to have totally different thoughts that you're going to argue for in a totally different way, which is true, but in a way kind of trivial. So in a way, it's a big disappointment um, for people that put great hopes in the power of people talking about things amongst each other. Um, I mean, Kierkegaard speaks about this a little bit in like his book called The Concluding Unscientific Postscript. He has these sections on rationality. There's sections that are a critique of Hegelian reason or Hegelian conceptions of reason. And there, paraphrasing him, what he ultimately says is that reason can never create comprehensive systems that can be accepted by everybody because the systems are built on premises that are fundamental choices of a type of non-rational nature. And in a way, he says that once you go back in a type of justificatory process, you get to a place where you say to yourself and you also declare to other people, here I stand. And you basically, draw a line in the sand and you say, this is my starting points. I go no further, you know. And out of that comes his idea of truth as subjectivity and comes, that's kind of like one of the many beginnings of existentialism, right? Um, so this idea that Kierkegaard is talking about is also in a way, is more subjective and more psychological than an idea that Wittgenstein has, but it is in a way Wittgenstein's idea also makes a similar point. Wittgenstein's last book, which is a book called Uncertainty, is the book that tries to talk about epistemological issues and tries to talk about justificatory processes of reasoning. And the way Wittgenstein describes a similar situation is that he says that every language game or every system of beliefs is going to ultimately depend on what he calls like hinged propositions. And these hinged propositions are, he uses the idea of a hinge, are propositions where everything else revolves around those propositions. They are the propositions that make the system move the way it does. And everything in a way, those propositions are the fulcrum of the system. And he says that some of those propositions might be of a logical nature, like A equals A, or if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. But he says that they don't have to be of that kind. They don't have to be like logical analytic truths. They can be, for example, the idea, I see my hand now. And that becomes a type of like fundamental experience that if that is not true, nothing is true, so to speak. And but as you can imagine, if this is actually the real architecture of reason, what we have is a really big problem because those hinge propositions might be different in different subjects, and no amount of reasoning will change them because they are what give reason as a process its form, so to speak. So, going back to the beginning, in Plato's Meno, he claims that the slave boy understands geometry because the slave boy shares in a common humanity that human beings have, and this common humanity is a humanity connected to the exercise of reason. And out of this idea has come a long, long, long tradition of what we call natural law, which is the idea that human beings have equality because they share in this like light of reason, for instance. You see it, for example, in Aquinas. Aquinas talks about the fact that human beings um, are humans because they share in this faculty of reason, and out of that comes a set of like natural rights that they have. But the natural rights come out of what he calls natural law, and natural law is a type of repackaging of ideas about the universal reason. Um, but from the beginning, there was a pushback of a type of social and political kind. For example, um, during like the 16th century, when like the Spanish crown ended up in America and ended up enslaving the native people in like an economic system called encomiendas. You got a debate that happened in Spain called the Valladolid debate, where like, Las Casas and this other person called Sepulveda engage in a discussion about if the Indians, if the Native Americans shared that common humanity. And Sepulveda was actually arguing against the idea, and Las Casas was, in a way, partially arguing in favor of this idea. So the idea that human beings don't even partake in abstract reason is an idea that historically has been a highly contested issue. So regardless of like the logical reasons that I have given about the lack of universality or reason as a common denominator of humans, there's actually a whole historical track record that the assumption that human beings share in a common rationality across the species, throughout the species, is a highly contested historical issue, you know. So which only adds insult to injury, right? Um, but the assumption that human beings share in this like natural law has been one of the cornerstones of what we call um, the liberal tradition and the social contract theory in political philosophy. The fact is that human beings can actually agree on a social contract because the idea of the social contract is that is like free rational individuals can come together and agree about principles of governance that they can all share. Now this idea has a further, has a previous precedent, right, in like the idea of like, the idea of the rule of law, which comes out of like the Magna Carta. And the rule of law is the idea that even the king needs to be subject to the law, you know. And it is a weaker notion of like of law there, but it's still the idea that we all need to bow to this higher faculty called reason, and that we all can understand that. And in a way, it's the idea that power is secondary to the law, you know. Um, when you go further forward, you finally get to an individual like Kant, Immanuel Kant, who bases most of his philosophy, certainly his practical philosophy in the Critique of Practical Reason, on the fundamental notion that human beings share in this common rationality, and that this common rationality is what makes them human. And out of that, he builds a whole edifice of morality, which dictates how is it that we assign responsibility, and how is it that we assign personhood, and how is that we make people guilty or not guilty, and how is it that we give people sovereignty or lack thereof. And all of these notions are built around the fundamental idea that human beings are capable of exercising this universal faculty of reason, and that the faculty of reason that they are able to exercise is one that is shared in common, that we all share it, right? Um, but then we have this whole tradition that I've already explained that tries to like erode this certainty that we actually have a universal notion that we share, and that universal notion of reason will lead to a type of convergence in matters of beliefs, right? And finally, you get to an individual like Habermas, who takes the idea of Kant and in a way modifies it. He says, well, reason doesn't really lie within the individual. Reason lies in the community. And if we just engage with each other in a particular way, which is this way of like free, undistorted communication, we are able to achieve a type of like collective convergence, right? But then there again, you get the idea that how does that jibe with the notion of power? And let's go back to Plato's Republic, right? Socrates was up in Athens, and the port of Piraeus is down at the seashore. You have to go down this hill, and there's a lot that has been said about that movement from up the hill to down to the port. And one of the ways that has been interpreted is a type of like metaphor that philosophy and the philosopher went from the lofty heights of like Athens to the port. And why is the port not lofty? Well, apparently the port is not lofty because in the port is where people do business. And number two, the port is not lofty because in the port you see a lot of people that are non-citizens interacting with each other, especially foreigners. So the port is a place of like contact between a lot of different types of people for the purposes of business. So you have two issues. You have the issues of the heterogeneity of people that are interacting, and number two, the overdriving motivation of interaction, which is actually commerce, which is in principle a type of self-interested engagement, right? And hence you get Cephalus and Polemarchus, who are rich merchants, and the way that they think about justice immediately is in a self-serving way. They say justice is a set of rules. For lack of a better term, justice is a set of rules that the powerful people built in order to run the show the way that is convenient for them, which is no different from the way we look at politics right now, right? With big powerful groups creating legal edifices that allow their actions to run smoothly, so to speak, and how difficult it is to question those legal frameworks, right? And then the legal frameworks get sold to people as quote unquote the law. But then, like Nietzsche would say, the law is not built by reason, the law is built by the lawgivers. And the lawgivers are the powerful people. So in a way, we get to an odd place where, for lack of a better term, like might makes right. So that leaves behind the second component, the idea of what are the transcendental conditions of the exercise of reason. The idealistic view is that the transcendental conditions are that we have a common shared humanity, and that common shared humanity is based on a common sharing of like the exercise of reason, and the reason is universal. And if we come as free subjects, we can then interact with each other, and the truth will emerge in a free marketplace of ideas, right? Now there's a dark notion that emerges that actually human beings are free, but they're self-interested, and that although we share in logic, we don't share in a lot of interests, and that those interests are a lot of times incommensurable, and that what happens in the marketplace of idea is a type of agonistics of power that gets played out by a type of ritual of like giving reasons. But the reasons are never the final point. If the reasons fail, what normally happens is that people exercise power then. So reason is kind of like a type of like ritual that we engage in, hoping that we don't have to use the recourse of power. So there we stand. There's like the people that believe in reason, and then there's the people that believe in power. And out of those two different ways of looking at things have come out two different ways of thinking about political philosophy. There's like idealistic political philosophies, and then there's actually realistic political philosophies. And one example of realistic political philosophies are like what we now call realpolitik, right? The idea that we have geopowers out in the world that are doing battle with each other by a struggle for influence, so to speak. Which leads us to the last point. And the last point is the material conditions of the exercise of reason. And in the material conditions, now we can move to like the 21st century, right? Not only we have individuals who have more power than others, and individuals that have like not only material power, like they own land or they have capital, but they have what you and I call social power or cultural power. They have what you and I call status, which is yet just a different kind of power, but power nonetheless, right? Um, so when people come to speak, they come as individuals, but they come leveraging all this power that they have, be it financial, material, social, or cultural. We can call it, they leverage all this capital. Um, so even though we might have democratic institutions of governance and we might have procedural democracy as a default way of doing things, those procedural democratic processes and those institutions are inscribed in a network of power that precedes them and transcends them. And hence the idea is how can we make the best of it, right? Now in the 21st century, we have extra problems to deal with. One of the problems that I believe we have is that in a lot of parts of the world, society has become virtual. So human beings don't meet together in the marketplace like Socrates used to meet, like his interlocutors. We meet through mediations, higher levels of mediations. A lot of us meet like in virtual spaces like we're doing right here, right? And that adds barriers to people, and it also adds capacities for control, for systemic controls. You can control the entry or the exit into these virtual spaces. You can control the way these virtual spaces frame issues. You can use formidable artificial intelligence and data mining tools to create a type of like, phenomenology of experience, so to speak, at the level of like individual conscience, which is what a lot of the systems are really trying to do. It's a type of soft power. It's a type of how do you control public opinion in ways that people don't realize that public opinion is being controlled, you know? And what a lot of the systems are really trying to do. Yeah. So, can you hear me?
Yes, you're right.
Okay, thank you. Um, so, so one of the ideas that we can wonder about is actually, well, what can we do about all this, right? There are formidable players that have access to immense amounts of capital. There are systems that are engulfing not only material life, but actually the life of the mind of most people. And more and more, there is a flight away from like the material world where we face each other face to face as bodies, right? And we inhabit these ethereal places of like experience, so to speak. Um, so the idea is actually, is there any way that we can reclaim some agency in at the level of like the material conditions of discourse? And I tell my students that one of the things that we can do is to avoid the desire or the tendency to walk away from society, to walk away from society at the level of bodies is what I mean. And to re-engage at the level of like, lived experience, to engage in a type of quotidian way, to go back to the streets, so to speak, and bump into each other, bump into strangers, because then you're forced to deal with people in a way as they are, rather than in these highly orchestrated theaters of engagement, you know. So I believe, and then the other needs to face you as an other, and needs to save face, so to speak, you know. And I believe that there's a powerful force that gets unleashed when people meet each other as bodies, so to speak. um Number two, which in a way should be number one, is that I tell my students there is always, to a certain extent, a capacity to walk away. And to walk away, I mean to walk away from a lot of these systems that are trying to engulf us. You know, we can choose not to use AI. We can choose to pay in cash. We can choose to meet in person. We can choose to meet as bodies. We can choose to find out things on our own. We can choose to do things locally. And we can choose to disengage from a lot of like the systems that are trying to absorb us, you know. But it requires a tremendous amount of fortitude to walk away from those things, you know. And one of the things that we need to fight, oddly enough, is actually the comfort and the convenience to be inside the system. And in a way, because being outside of the system is a hindrance, and it's an inconvenience, you know. And I think we need to get used to being inconvenienced. And in a way, oddly enough, we need to make our lives more difficult rather than less difficult if we want to be in a better place. Because if we don't walk against the grain, what is going to happen is that the system is going to acquire higher levels of systemic integration, and we're going to be absorbed into the system, and we're going to be subsumed to it. Now, the system works according to its own logic, and the logic is what I like to call, in a way, like making, you know, reference, so to speak, to like the work of Jean-Francois Lyotard in like the postmodern condition. The system works according to a principle of operationality, which basically means that what is convenient for the system will happen, and what is not convenient for the system, it's just not going to happen. Now, at the level of the bodies, of human bodies, what comes out of that idea is that an erosion of human rights. If living things that we call humans, what we used to call fellow humans, if fellow humans cannot be easily integrated into the system, well, those people are expendable then. And if they cannot be integrated into the system, they should not be integrated into the system. And then there's issues like what Judith Butler calls grievability. And the fact is that when you don't integrate those people into the system, you marginalize them. And the ultimate marginalization that exists is death, right? Now, but the system won't grieve those bodies, and they won't grieve those people, because those people are in a way ungrievable. The system's reality principle cannot absorb those people as people, because it just would be a contradiction to the system's overarching, you know, rule, which is the principle of operationality. The only thing that matters is the things that make the system work smoothly. And whatever doesn't make the system work smoothly, and the systems to have an increased capacity to absorb yet more of the territory, for lack of a better term, will be selected against, so to speak. Um, so so I believe that, you know, one of the ways to understand this is by an idea of fragmentation. The system wants to integrate us, and we should just like become outlaws, and we should fragment, and we should walk away from a lot of things that don't really have any value. I teach at a university, and they're like shoving down our throats the integration of AI into our classrooms, even though at the very same time they have a secondary discourse about all the ills of artificial intelligence. And what I do is I just simply refuse. I refuse. I teach with a blackboard, and I do it on purpose. Even though I do understand that PowerPoint has conveniences, I actually do not engage in those conveniences on purpose. Um, But I believe that it is a very isolated scenario, an isolating scenario, and it requires a lot of fortitude and it requires a lot of clarity of mind because the system creates such a strong reality principle that you're always questioning um, the soundness of what you're doing. You're always doing a double take on like, am I being crazy or am I being neurotic or am I being just like um, a technology hater or what have you? Um, and one has to every single day wake up in the morning and kind of like get back like the reference points and try to go forwards on in a way on one's own. And um, and I believe that out of that exercise, a certain kind of critique that can come out and ultimately the intersubjective critique that we can engage in is not a critique where I present reasons and you accept them, but is the critique that Wittgenstein used to call the critique of like of a philosophy as therapy. The idea that we come together and we try to think about how is it that we're living our lives, how is it that this whole thing hangs together, what things are made possible by the way things hang together, and what kind of desires and aspirations we have that are not being taken care by this system of thought, and in a way replace elements and cut things away. And it is a type of collective therapeutic process of a type of conceptual kind. It's very difficult to do because a lot of people believe that philosophy is just simply accepting a catechism, a set of like principles and live their lives according to these principles, instead of philosophy as a verb, as an activity, and as an activity that is a critical activity, you know. And I believe that Socrates is one of like the paradigmatic examples of how that is done, or a guy like Kierkegaard, or a guy like Nietzsche, or a guy like Wittgenstein, and they all have similar notions of how this is done. And in a way, all of them except Wittgenstein have this strange idea of irony. And irony is an interesting notion because irony is one of those psychological tools that allows you not to take yourself super seriously, which I think is a good characteristic. And it's also a way that you can approach difficult topics with other people without alienating them, right? Um, and hence I've taken upon myself recently to try to like go back and re-engage with the figure of Socrates and try to see what sort of ethos he represents and what kind of like lessons we can get from him and bring to the 21st century. A lot of the ideas that I said about walking away from the system are very similar to the ideas of like Diogenes the Cynic, right? Which Diogenes the Cynic belonged to the Cynic school of thought, which was actually one of the schools that we used to call the Socratic schools. So in a way, there's a lot of like convergences that come out of this way of thinking about things. And and yeah, I don't really have anything else to say at the moment. I mean, I think this topic is very, very big and that a lot more thought needs to go into a lot of these things that I've just mentioned. So I'm gonna stop right there.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your deep, insightful, and very philosophical engagement. Now I request respected participant on our Zoom platform to share some of their reflections. Yeah, Ananta Bhai has joined us, so I would first like to invite Anant Giri to share some of his reflections.
Thank you, Ivan, and dear friends. Because of a contingency, I joined you late, and nice listening to you. Let me hear the thoughts of other friends, and I would come at the end.
Yeah, so we'll invite Dr. Gyan and also those who are interested to share some of their reflections. Please indicate me in the chat box. Yeah, Dr. Gyan Gloy. as she's
Thank you very
yeah.
much. Yes, I am sorry because I am on the street. I am not at home. I could follow. It was very interesting, very instructive. Of course, for me, since I am dealing also now, I have been dealing for many years, but also now, of course, with Plato's Republic, it was of particular interest and of particular enrichment. In this moment, I have no particular observations. I was meditating on the richness of the content and I could take many notices. And of course, many, I would have rather than a commentary, a question that is whether the parts, the sections of the exposition regarding Habermas could be perhaps a little bit extended, because I found very interesting what it was said about Habermas. On this aspect of Habermas, I must admit I never reasoned in that way and never interpreted Habermas in that way. And therefore, I would be very interested in perhaps in some further observation, if it is possible. Now I know that the time is not so on our side, it is limited. But if it would be possible to have some further observation notices on Habermas in that way of interpretation, I would be very grateful. I thank you very much. Anyway, it was really very interesting. I'm sorry that I have to speak in that way, but today I could not reach home for the session, and therefore I have to speak directly from the smartphone. I hope that I am audible. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit about Habermas if you guys want me to do that. Can I do that?
Please, sir.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the first thing is that Habermas, there are at least two Habermases. There's like the early Habermas, who is a person that comes from a type of like Marxist point of view and a type of sociological approach, and an individual who was interested in systems thinking. So he was interested in Luhmann, and he was interested in Parsons, and he was interested in like Marx, and he was interested in like Freud. And that is the Habermas that I like the most. And it is the Habermas that was involved in a type of systemic critique. So he was trying to see how like modern liberal capitalist society is built, and what are the points where we can try to like change the system, so to speak. And I found that Habermas incredibly enlightening and incredibly useful for me. Now there's the second Habermas, this Habermas, what is called the Habermas of the theory of communicative action. And I believe that Habermas is a type of like Kantian Habermas. It's a type of individual that is moving into a type of like discourse analysis, and in a way is leaving society behind. Is the Habermas that considers, you know, Kant and mixes it with Weber, and it is a Habermas that is trying to find a ground of like universal justification for things. It's a Habermas that is interested in foundations, so to speak. But he's not only interested in foundations because he's interested in epistemological issues. I think that Habermas himself is an individual that actually, in a way, is a type of like, he stands in a particular type of place. And in a way, like the comments that I made about Kierkegaard, in a way, there's a way of describing Habermas according to those claims. You know, Habermas is an individual that had, as his earliest formative experiences, the experiences of like the German Third Reich. You know, Habermas as a child went through the experience of Nazism. And for him, these Nietzschean conclusions that I am bringing forwards are incredibly disturbing and incredibly problematic, to the point that he is not willing to accept that as his starting point, because if he accepts this metaphysics of power as what is actually at the ground of being, then one has a lot of trouble stopping Nazism from ever happening again. Because the fact is that metaphysics of power doesn't close the door to the possibility of a totalitarian force in the future to gain ascendancy and take over. which is what we see right now happening in the United States, for instance, of course, right? Um, but Habermas, in a way, has actually a set of non-negotiables, and one of the non-negotiables is the idea that that certain things are unthinkable, and one of the things that is unthinkable is that reason is just an effect of power. And there you get like the debates between Habermas and Foucault, for instance, right? In the case of Foucault, you get a different type of like experience of the war, right? In France, you have the experience of the French resistance, where like to an overwhelming totalitarian power, you just like you confront it with guerrilla activity. You just like put your body on the line and you try to like beat it, by outfoxing it, so to speak, but without any idea that reason is going to be on your side. It's like you see Sartre talking about how does like the young man decides that he's going to leave his mother in the farm and go fight for the resistance, and how can he justify that from a moral point of view? And the answer is that he can't. Those are fundamental choices and you go with them, and unless you have a lot of moral luck, your efforts and your choice might be erroneous, and your life might be an absolute failure. You might leave your mother at the farm and go join the resistance, and you might get killed the next day, for instance. And people like Sartre and people like the French, or at least those French, had an understanding that we need to have a type of moral conscience that doesn't depend on those assurances that Habermas cannot live without. And I get it. I mean, I get it in the sense that I understand how that system of thought is built. Um, and I mean, Habermas' system of thought would work. I mean, in the sense of like, if we are able to deal with the material conditions of the exercise of power, which basically means if we were able to create societies that are more economically equal and societies that power is distributed more evenly, and if we were able to live in societies that are more homogeneous, at least at the level of like the education that everybody receives, we would have like material conditions that might allow us to gain some traction and basically would make us more similar to each other, and therefore our chances of agreeing would be higher because we would have fundamental starting points that are more akin, you know. So as society becomes more unequal, and also as societies become more polarized, and as society become more pluralistic and heterogeneous, what happens is that the barriers to an agreement on fundamental matters just gets compounded and compounded and compounded. And the only way that I can see a way out of it is actually to, if you want to be like a Habermas type of individual, is to fight those inequalities, make people more the same, and make people more financially at the level, so to speak. Because when you have people that are more similar, they will have more similar life experiences that will make them more, have a higher tendency to converge and to agree. Um, Now, number one, there's the idea of like, can we do that? Can we make society more equal? And number two, do we want to do that? So what I mean is actually, what is the price? What is the price of convergence? Because there's always a price. There's always a price. So when societies become like Scandinavian societies, they have a lot more agreement, but then they are Scandinavian societies and they look like that, where everybody looks the same and everybody acts the same. So in a way, these solutions are not like really clearly superior. We have to decide that we will live with lower levels of inequality, but with higher levels of homogeneity, and that there will be a cost to that, a cost in human experience and a cost in human diversity of experiences, and it is an idea of like, is the price is right? I mean, in the United States right now, we're living polarizations and economic inequalities and pluralisms that are so extreme that they become so chaotic and dysfunctional that I believe that the price that we're paying for pluralism and so-called freedom in the United States is just absolutely not worth it. It's just not worth it. So there is a point where the drive towards homogeneity is a clear positive choice, I believe. And I believe that in a place like the United States right now, we have gone way past that line, you know. And I believe that one of the places that you can homogenize people is by creating universal education that creates a type of like, you know, Bildung for everybody that is similar, and also to create societies that are either smaller or more regional, because regionalism gives you more similar reference points. The United States has the perfect storm of like a very, very big country that is very federalized and that is very unequal. And you, in a way, you don't have any of the saving graces of smallness or any of the saving graces of homogeneity or any of the saving graces of like economic equality. You just have nothing. You just have strife is what you have. And I believe that that's just incredibly disruptive and incredibly destructive for any attempt at a type of Habermasian notion of like fulfilling the ideal conditions of like communicative rationality's discourse. And that's all I have to say about that.
Thank you so much. Now I would invite Dr. Amir. Would you like to share some of your reflections briefly? Doctor, yeah.
Hello.
Yes, please share.
Yeah. Good evening.
Good evening.
Yeah. So I don't have much to say, but it was really a wonderful talk, and it connected me with what I'm currently working on. That is Hannah Arendt's idea of public sphere.
Yeah.
She reminds me that public. In fact, she reminds us that public sphere is not just a physical place or something institutions give us. So it comes alive when people step out of private isolation and appear before one another through speech and action, or what you were talking about. So that's what, in Arendtian sense, we have to create those conditions for people to appear, speak freely, and begin something in common without reducing, politics or our day-to-day affairs as mere obedience. So, and also our idea of natality, that really adds to this whole talk. Every human being carries the capacity to begin again, to start something that was not there before. That's why I think politics at its best is not, only a critique of the system, but it is also the courage to initiate new forms of life together. So thank you so much. It was really a brilliant talk.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I'll just mention some things there. The In my school, I have young students, they're like 20 years old. They're full of life. I mean, at least like in principle, they're full of life. They're young organisms, and and it is very, very difficult to get them to meet together. Very, very difficult. You make meetings and nobody shows up. They show up to one meeting and they never show up again. Um, and if you ask them why they didn't show up, there is no answer beyond the fact that they find human interaction very, very inconvenient and very talling, and they prefer the aloneness that they have and their interface with what we call the system as more comforting. I believe that that's a particularly strong reality for what we call, like, developed nations, you know But it is not only developed nations anymore, because the system of information technology now has penetrated everywhere. But it is particularly problematic in societies like the United States, which I believe are very, very way ahead in this experiment of like social anomie and alienation, and I believe that in a country like the United States, the chances of what we call political mobilization are incredibly low, because society has been dismantled. There is no social capital left that people can leverage and like use for different kinds of initiatives. And hence, to start anew in a place like the United States, it would require, I think, honestly, I think it would require an external event. It would require like, an epidemic. It would require like, an asteroid to hit the planet. It would require some catastrophic event that would be so disturbing that people would have to get out of their like their their self-isolation at the level of conscience, and that's what my son is, a very grim person, and he's 22 years old, and he says that what we need is a reset, and the resets that he's talking about are like that, are incredibly violent external events. If planet Earth would lose 1 billion people in like 5 years, or 2 billion people in 5 years, that might be a type of like reset force. But as long as people can live within the comfort of their lives and live like lives of quiet desperation, they will continue doing so, even to the detriment of their very own lives. And in part, it has to do with the fact that by now, the social capital that was built for centuries has become almost totally eroded. There's just nothing left. In the United States, there's no brotherhood of mankind left. There's just none. Like social space in the United States has become Euclidean space. And human beings have stopped being persons, that they become points moving from point A to point B in some sort of like, Cartesian space, and out of that metaphysics of the social, nothing good can come out. You're working with very, very meager resources, and those meager resources also create a type of like human subject that is incapable of reading cues, incapable of like emotional sensibility, incapable of empathy, incapable of like imaginative identification, incapable of like most things that human beings had taken for granted as the basic package of being a human. Even 40-30 years ago, even in the 1990s, people were still human. And just to use a pithy remark, I am beginning to find that the transhuman has proven to be very, very inhuman.
Thank you, Dr. Bandari. Would you like to share some of your remarks, sir? Maybe Minati Pradhanji, would you like to share something?
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you. It was very deep presentation. So I was just wondering about two basic questions, like to which issues, what are the issues we can actually apply the public reason? That is one query. And the second one was that, in this modern society, we are facing so many, political polarization. So how can the ideal public reason flourish? So these were the two basic queries I have. Thank you.
Yeah. I think there are ways of mitigating this problem. For instance, in the case of public reasons, capacity to bring people together for common projects, I believe that one of the things that we can do is like when public reason falters at a level of abstraction, one of the ways out of that predicament is to make our discussions way and way more concrete. And I've become very insistent now that when I meet with people, I want to meet for a purpose, and the purpose has to be definite and it has to be concrete, and I have to have a type of metric of what is it that we're trying to achieve, and then let's just try to achieve that. Of course, in a way, it's a way of rigging the conversation because I eliminate the issue of talking about the telos. The telos is already given because we're meeting to solve this problem that has a telos. It has actually a goal, the ultimate goal. And now I tend to not engage in conversations that are fully speculative, that we're just going to sit around and just talk like, abstractly about abstract notions in an abstract way. I have no interest in that. If you want to talk about something concrete in a concrete way, that we need to make sure that in 45 minutes or an hour, we come out with like what people call like, deliverables or like, actionable items, I will talk to you, but I won't just sit around, quote unquote, to philosophize, because I believe that those philosophizings, um, um, ultimately, I believe they're exercises in alienation, which connects me to like the second point that I'm going to say, which is like a lot of times when people do philosophy, I see it a lot with my students. They throw out all this terminology that they read in some book, and they build these big castles in the sand. And they're a lot of times my students are very eloquent. That's what they are attracted to philosophy in the 21st century, because philosophy in the 21st century is about talking really, and about talking in a particular way. And they develop that talent of talking like that, like what I call like that. And what I do a lot of times with them is that after they give me like their big philosophical palace, I tell them, okay, so what would happen if tomorrow we become that thing? So what do I do? And they're like, well, and I said, okay, well, I woke up tomorrow at 7 a.m. So I start how I start being that thing that you're telling me. So, and in a way, what I'm saying to them is actually you build this edifice, which is, it takes imagination and certain like logical rudiments, but what is the use of this? How can this be instantiated in reality? What is the cash value of this? How does this look in the world? How does this way of thinking would change your life or my life at the most concrete level? Like again, and I always like to insist on that. Again, they start like talking in abstraction. Said, no. It's tomorrow, Monday, and it's 7 a.m. So I woke up and I embraced your philosophy last night before going to sleep. So I'm starting to walk out of my bed. So how is my day going to look like now? And a lot of times they have no answer. And if they don't have answer, I tell them, if you don't have any answer, your ideas have no value. Your ideas are an exercise in a type of like leveraging of cultural capital, that it's an exercise in narcissism. If your ideas don't have a way to illuminate reality in a fruitful way, and if your ideas don't are not embodied in a way of life, then to me, those are two very clear indicators that your ideas should not be accepted, and very, 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 very few students are capable of articulating any meaningful vision of how these ideas would have any inherence in reality. And number two, they have hardly any interest in making their life be in alignment with any ideas. For them, these ideas are just simply a type of simulacrum that they put out there every day so that they can have this avatar that and there's another problem. My students are young people who have lived a lot of their years of like becoming social selves on the internet and in social media. So my students have a lot of trouble understanding ideas about alienation. For them, their social life is their life. And I'm like, no, but you still live in a house that costs $2,000 a month. You still have a car that you need to pay and you're not paying. You still have like a body that's gonna get ill or not. You are not a brain in a vat. You might want to see yourself as a brain in a vat, but the fact is that you're not. So your life looks like the life of the neighbor that you hate because he has all the wrong ideological views, but he lives exactly the identical life that you're living at the level of material existence. You have a new car, you live in a big house, you drive 40 miles to wherever you need to be for reasons that are unclear. You want to save the planet, but you're driving your car 40 miles every day. Your neighbor doesn't care about the planet, and he drives 40 miles, every single day. So what is the difference between you and your neighbor? Oh, I want to save the planet. But in what ways are you saving the planet? Oh, well, then you're not. In fact, your neighbor is more, has more integrity, because at least your neighbor's thoughts, they map out with reality, with their reality. They don't care about the planet, so they drive 40 miles. You care about the planet, but you drive 40 miles. So what does that make you? It makes you into a liar. And I bring them back down to reality over and over. And a lot of them just get very, very fatigued and very, very anxious about it. But I believe that needs to be fought. Like that discomfort needs to be fought, and they need to be. A lot of human beings just need to be made straight up uncomfortable. I believe that discomfort is not a bad trait, especially if we're fighting these battles. Because it's so easy to confuse this world of experiences and ideas that are completely isolated with reality. And in a way, the battles that we're fighting right now are like the battles that are the most primitive battles, the battles for what is real, the battles for what is human, And those battles, I think, need to be fought very strongly, because the forces at play are just very, 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 very overwhelming.
Thank you, sir. I also would like to ask one question.
Yep.
Like, is public region dead in America? Or but what I consider means, for me, public region, I mean a discussion which at least on matters of public policy. And I think it is primarily, essentially to the conduct of a democracy. And now everywhere, not in just in America, but also in India, we are losing public region at the one hand, and another hand, there is an emergence of right-wing politics where they systematically, destroy the agencies of public region. And of course, there is a different. Of course, we talk about democracy, but everywhere there is a only plutocracy and oligarchy. So, of course, America and India is different, but why this is a kind of pattern that we are seeing, that death of public region, death of agencies of cultivation of public region, particularly the death of the initiative of citizenship building for that. So why this trend are emerging nowadays? Yes, thank you.
I mean, one of the reasons I believe is that in Western societies, which is what I know best, it's the idea that the political class has become a bureaucratic class. So the political class has no interest in having like direct democracy. Um, the political class is a clientelist class that is at the service of the power brokers and the service of like the big monetary interest. And they're, for lack of a better term, they're just facilitators. They're a bunch of lackeys. So the fact is that the democratic systems that we have in the United States and in Europe, at least, have no interest in like political participation from the citizenry. So, for example, civic society is seen as an afterthought instead of seeing as actually the bedrock that builds higher levels of political agency and political organization, which is the way it should be in a well-functioning democracy, right? You start in the streets and you build upwards through processes of deliberation that need to move upward, and you only move upwards in a well-functioning democracy. You only move upwards when it's necessary to move upwards. Otherwise, you resolve the problem at the lowest level of like political deliberation. That's the way it should be. But that's just not the way it is anymore. The political class is a bureaucratic class that is connected to like the moneyed interests. So that's one of the reasons. I mean the public exercise of reason has lost its political dimension, for lack of a better term. You know, and now what we have is just simply opinions that people put on their Twitter account, right? You know, but again, I mean, even if we were able to engage in political dialogue that aims at finding solutions for our problems, the idea of what our problems are is a matter of it's contested, you know, and some of the contested terrain is actually to claim that it's a contested terrain is disingenuous, you know. But in other cases, the problems are not that easy to, like, rebuff like that. It's not so easy to claim, oh, that's actually, you know you're a lot of times it's not easy to figure out what is the problem and what should be the problem. I'll just give you one example of that. um let's suppose that it's a town has, like, $1 million that they have as a surplus from, like, their previous budget, and the town comes together and they need to figure out what they're going to do with this, like, $1 million. Well, they can use the $1 million to give every citizen $1,000 and let the citizens do whatever they want with those $1,000. They could take the $1 million and rebuild a place where people play, like, rugby, or they could take the $1 million and use it for a library and, like, buying resources at the library. They could put it in, like, rebuilding the sidewalks of the town. They could put it in order to buy the mayor of town a beautiful car and a beautiful house. They could use it to provide all children with, like, immunization all until the age of 12. And the fact is that these are competing goods, and a lot of these competing goods are not clearly more valuable than others. I can see how you can generate an argument that would make that good a fundamental good that we should actually promote. But there's only $1 million, so we need to make a decision of where the $1 million are going to be allocated. So what I'm saying is, like, when we start thinking about a problem, immediately, if we go back into justifying the problem as we're describing it, or if we go forward trying to figure out how to provide solutions to the problem, immediately it appears to me that there creeps up a set of fundamental opinions about what is of value in life and what is of value in this particular case. And very quickly, we get to a place where people disagree in fundamental ways about how to interpret, quote unquote, the facts of the matter. I mean, we also have the problem that a lot of times we don't know what the facts of the matter are. And number two, that they lie to us about the facts of the matter. But even if we had the facts of the matter, interpreting the facts of the matter is already a hermeneutics that universal reason finds to be an unsurmountable exercise. So very quickly, a person will defend the arts, and another person will defend basic health care, and another person will defend the honor of the town leaders, and another person will defend the aesthetics of the town. And all of these are different values, and they don't really acquire univocal importance unless situations get really, really, really bad. So for example, if you have children that are starving, you unless you're completely insane, I would think that you would think that the $1 million should go to the starving children, right? But once you move away from that, you're just left in this world where you're just, like, trying to make decisions about between apples and oranges, and those decisions become a type of, like, assertion of, like, what you consider to be of value. And let's look at the case of, like, let's look at the case of a right wing ascendancy, the ascendancy of the right wing politics in the world. Okay,
Yeah,
One way,
thank you. Yeah, I just two of our participants. I would just like to invite all of them, and I
okay.
would request you to please answer at the end of the session. So, Luck, I can invite you. Yeah, Lux, would you like to say some of your points, sir? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Uh, like I really agree with the agree in terms of the social capital how it is getting broken. That is true. In fact, I am noticing it. I work on education, especially in the universities. What I am witnessing in India is kind of a situation where academic social capital appears to be enhanced almost exclusively through publications mirroring the logic of market capitalism. That's the first point I have written in the chat box also. But my concern in terms of what you said, it's a brilliant word talk. In fact, um, don't you think that your well-intended, action-oriented approach might end up instrumentalizing philosophy? Because uh, the action part is very important, but at times it has its own logic of keeping it as an intrinsic one, which is very esoteric and academic. What could be your take on it? Thank you.
I mean, what you're saying is completely true. The fact is that by me defending the practicality of a solution, it's just in a way a reaction to a momentary um, civilizational problem that we have. In a world where we would have a well-ordered society, for instance, I would then think that the philosophical task might be to engage in like the most free-ranging philosophical speculation that we can engage in. So, I mean, my embrace and my penchant for the promotion of a type of like, hard-nosed realism is just as a reaction to a civilizational lack of unmooring that we have. But, like, in a way, it's a type of dialectics of thought. If the world would become a well-ordered society, we could engage in more highly speculative things. I understood at some, I'll give you an example. I used to teach the strangest courses when I started my academic career. I specialize in weird courses, and I was always pushing to like the extremes of thought. I was always operating at the margins of like the thinkable or the unthinkable, and my courses were known to be like what people would call far out. But then America, which is where I have built my academic career, became more and more deteriorated and more deteriorated, and the public discourse became more mediocre and more like lacking even the most fundamental capacity for rational coherence. you know and at some point about 10 years ago, I decided that I if I was going to have any sort of like integrity as a human being and as a person with conscience, I needed to go back and try to teach people the fundamentals that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and that being less poor is better than being more poor, and that and that ideas about individuality need to be made more complicated than like their ridiculous delusional notions of what individuality might mean and might entail. And to my great sorrow, I had to go back into the classroom to teach a type of philosophy that I find at some level to be like prosaic. you know it's a type of simplism. But as society becomes more and more deteriorated, and it's like the culture becomes more devoid of what I would call intelligence, I have been forced to go back and teach, like, for example, I mostly teach logic now, which up until the mid 90s or the year 2000, I thought that logic is just like the most sterile way of being a philosopher. I thought that the value of teaching logic was simply very, very low, and that what philosophy should do is just build metaphysical edifices that will allow people to imagine different worlds. But I have left all of that behind as society became more and more deteriorated, and now I'm just trying to get people just to even be able to follow the most fundamental logical um, inferences, and that's what happened to me, so to speak. It's kind of like if
Yeah,
you're
that's
like it's kind of like if
yeah,
you're
yeah, I,
I'll finish with this sentence. My father was a very high level surgeon. He used to be a heart surgeon, and he did incredibly complicated operations. And he got more sophisticated and more sophisticated and more sophisticated. So the operations became more um, experimental. And at some point, he got to like the limits of it. And he says, by now, I operate on people that have such severe physiological problems that are reflected in a heart that doesn't work. But in a way, even if I fix their heart, they have digestion issues. They have issues of thinking. They are like they're broken as individuals so badly that even if I fix their heart, everything else will just lead to a life of low quality of life. And he struggled with that because he didn't want to abandon the experimental work that he was doing because he found it beautiful and he found it intellectually stimulating. But he said, if he told me if I had any kind of like integrity, I would just go back and I would open a clinic in a poor area and I would just take care of babies that have diarrhea. That's what I should really do instead of like being operating on hearts that are broken, which is ridiculous against the backdrop of like the realities of the medical needs of my country. He comes from an island in the Caribbean. So like, there's a lot of poverty there, and they're like people that have like real fundamental problems. So anyway, that's what I have to say.
I completely understand. Like, it was just to get your alternative views, but I'm emotionally with you in terms of the action, which Marx clearly mentioned in terms of going beyond the interpretation rather than philosophy. That's really a insightful one. Thank you.
I have to say that like the wisdom that I've gained recently is a wisdom that has cost me very much, and it has caused me very much sadness because it's a wisdom that comes out with actually realizing the narrowing of perspectives and the increase in like the severity of the problems. It reminds me of like Nietzsche, like Zarathustra, where like Zarathustra goes down to goes up to the mountain and gets this incredible spiritual insights. And he says, I'm going to go help humanity. So he goes down to the valley. And what he finds is that humanity is quote unquote not ready for his message. And he has this funny phrase that he says, I've come too early, He just thinks that my insights are not what these people need, and that like, they need to go through like a lot of other processes before we can even engage in even like the minimal set of these insights that I've acquired with such love and with so much effort. And a lot of like that book is a book full of like sadness and irony, and I find that's one of the most interesting parts of that book. Like what do we do with this like beautiful thoughts that we conjure up, you know?
Yeah.
Thank you, Ivan. Continuing the conversation, now we have with us Henny. So, Ibu Henny from Yogyakarta, Indonesia. Ibu Henny, please share some of your thoughts. Okay, as it's taking some time now, I would share some thoughts. Thank you. In your concluding section of your presentation, you referred to philosophy as a verb. And as philosophy is action, philosophy is verb, but also that verb is not just reactive verb, or that verb has a meditative dimension. And so with the urgency of social life, our interlinked life of body, mind, material, spiritual, how do we cultivate verb which is simultaneously active and meditative? The second thought is about the multiplex reality and challenge of integration. While the limits of systemic integration are well taken, But at the same time, with and beyond the limits of systemic integration, there is a need to connect with each other. And that is also a task with all of us, as you also acknowledge the need for certain kind of homogeneity. Possibly you are using it for lack of a better word, but which means that the need for a certain kind of we, and that we is pluralistically constituted. So it is in that sense that how do we develop a new art of connection or a new art of integration, which is not just, it is not a opposition between fragmentation and integration. And the third thing is about with all this as philosophy and therapy, philosophy as a kind of therapy, but that philosophy as therapy also is a soul therapy. And Wittgenstein was attentive to that. All of the people you mentioned, Kierkegaard and others. And so, how do we develop a art of soulful social therapy, in psychoanalysis, in our spiritual life? And finally, with your very important dialogue with Roti, the book is about Roti, and thank you for sending. I spent the most of the day today in looking at that and reading it. Very important work. For example, epistemology and hermeneutics, social solidarity and objective. Just for a moment to think about epistemology and hermeneutics. And with Roti and beyond, how challenging these tasks are. But one challenge is that pluralizing both of these themes, epistemology and hermeneutics. For example, with epistemology, not only the kind of epistemology Roti is critiquing, there are also varieties of epistemological formations. Boaventura de Sousa Santos, the great sociologist and philosopher, he talks about epistemologies of the South. Now,
Yeah.
with Roti, then Roti's critique of epistemology is in fact critique of a particular kind of epistemology. And then Roti also has written a book called Achieving Our Country. And therefore, in fact, achieving our country, this our country today, and making America great again, MAGA, for example. Now, what are the continuities between a project like Roti's Achieving Our Country and MAGA, or Making America Great Again? Here, just for a kind of opening up, along with many critics, you refer towards the end Chantal Mouffe, very important, and agonal democracy, and also associational economics. You refer to that. And you also presented very creatively your own critique of a kind of a naive, participatory democracy, a very multi-layered process of democratic life. I think it is very helpful because all of us, we do take part, but at the same time, we realize the complexity. A very important task remains, for example, a possible conversation between Richard Rorty and Fred Almayer, who wrote also a book called Achieving Our World. And a scholar from India, Anindita Balslev, I remember in 1990, Professor Rorty came to India and he visited different parts of India. And I had the chance to meet him in Delhi. And there was a seminar, a whole day seminar devoted to discussing with Professor Rorty. He's a very kind man, edge of conversation, a very kind, respectful conversationalist. So Anindita and Balslev, a professor from India, she's no more with us, as Professor Rorty is also no more with us. So the whole question of ethnocentrism, and so therefore with Rorty and this kind of a philosophical work, And he begins speaking your reference to story and the narrative. It is one kind of story. But one kind of story is meant to be submitted to multiple kind of stories. Therefore, the conversation of the humankind that you talk about, it requires that our philosophical project, beginning with one kind of story like liberal democracy, also interacts with other kind of stories. Therefore, the need for transcultural dialogue and also trans-religious dialogues, because Roti, coming from, Roti and religion, some work has been done. But with you also, with your reference to critique in the whole book, public reason and the marketplace, also there is a spirituality, there is a kind of a very critical and what could say an agonal spirituality at work in deep in your body, questioning, isn't it? And that is the spiritual. Our great Habermas also in 1980 edited a book called uh, Reflections on the Spiritual Conditions of Our Age. Therefore, that spiritual is there in your work, in your critique, but also possibly it requires a further opening up, a further elaboration, because along with multiple tasks that we have, is also a task of an interconnected spiritual. So I just want to submit some of these thoughts for your consideration.
Yeah, I'll say a few things about all the things that you mentioned. I think one way of putting it together. Well, I'll start with Rorty. As the years have gone by and I've gotten older and like the world has changed and I've become a different type of person, I really have come to believe that Rorty is an individual that needs to be submitted to a type of like post-colonial critique, because I think he's like too facile with his attitudes about like democracy can take care of itself, so to speak, with this idea that we just muddle through and everything is going to be working out fine. And in a way, if it doesn't work fine, then then it doesn't work fine. And I'm like, well, that's very easy to say for an individual that knows that he ended up in the good side of life and then ended up in the good side of history. So it's easy for you to not think about the high stakes of this game, because the high stakes don't really affect you. And I believe that although I agree with like his philosophical critique, I don't agree with like the nonchalance that he has and that he displays a lot of times, this smugness of his like attitude of like what ifs, and I believe that I believe that he would benefit from a type of like, from a higher level of gravitas and from a type of like tragic Greek philosophy sensibility, where a lot of times we're going to be put in places where whatever decision we make is going to have really bad consequences, and that we need to embrace that. So we need to have responsibility that in a way is kind of like radical responsibility, ultimate responsibility. And we cannot just simply hand wave and say, oh, well, that didn't work out. I mean, it reminds me, you talk about Rorty going to India. I contacted Rorty years ago and he sent me an article that he wrote while he was in India. And, and it's an article called Love and Money. And it's kind of like, it's a type of like travel log, philosophical reflection. And I always remember this part where he has like his liberal views and his like, fallibilistic views and his like ironic views and like, and his ideas about solidarity. And he says that he went, I mean, ultimately the article is about like, I went to India and the experience of being in the world there just broke me. It just broke me. And he said, I ended up at the end of one day in Delhi, I ended up going back to my hotel and just dropping off there dead and thinking, this is a mess that has no solution, and like, you know, in a way, the hell with this. And in a way, he found himself meeting with his limits, his limits of empathy, his limits of thinking, his limits of feeling, his limits of solutions that he could provide. In a way, his philosophy wasn't built for that world, and he just like hit him in the face like a ton of bricks. Interestingly enough, he never published this article, which I found very, well, very interesting, because the article was really, really, really interesting. And so that's number one. Number two, I don't really like the idea of philosophy as therapy, because it feels still very, what I call very country club. It feels like we just meet together in a room and we just talk about ourselves and feel, feel that we made headway in our own with our own inner hangups. You know, the way Wittgenstein called it is actually we become bewitched by language, or the way like that Kierkegaard calls it, he says like, you know, I'm trying just to save my soul, and so on and so forth. I tend to like more to understand this idea in a much more embodied way. And in a way, I find that one idea that I've never been able to substitute by a better idea is just the idea of Gandhi, of like experiments in truth. And I believe that that idea has not been improved upon. I mean, Dewey and John Stuart Mill had a similar idea. They call it the experiments in living. But I like the idea of like Gandhi better, the image of Gandhi, because the image of Gandhi, I can repurpose it from a hermeneutical point of view. Because what he means by a living truth, or a truth that can be lived, is a type of hermeneutical slash phenomenological experience. And I find that there's a lot of mileage there that one can take advantage of, you know, and that connects me to the idea about pluralism, and how we can defend pluralism from a type of epistemological point of view. And it reminds me of like the ideas of Gadamer in like Truth and Method, where Gadamer basically says that in a way, truth is going to be the sum total of all the possible perspectives that you could have on a lived experience. So if you want to know what is the truth of the world, you would have to come up with like the countless possibilities of being in the world, and that this summation of like all these horizons is what then the truth becomes. And in a way, it's a type of synthetic, empathetic, somatic integration of all the richness and multiplicity of like human experience and cosmic experience, because it transcends even the human species, you know. And I believe that that is the spiritual dimension of myself, so to speak. And my epistemological quest is of that kind. And I try to tell my students when they're struggling with things, I always tell them, like, you know, instead of reading another book, go throw yourself out there and have experiences that you would never have had. Meet people that you would never have met. Talk to people that you don't even see as people. You know, you want to know about yourself, don't read another book. Go and run 3 miles, and then run 3 miles again the next day, and run 3 miles again. You will learn a lot more about you if you run 3 miles for 3 months, because it will put you through experiences that don't have any discursive equivalent, you know. And I believe that there's a type of like you know, Taoist or Zen Buddhist idea about the limits of discursive wisdom and discursive experiences, you know. And a lot of my students, like my very better students, I tell them, you need to have embodied experiences of the world, because a lot of my smart students have spent all their lives just reading books. So they just fall in love with different books and different thinkers. And I'm like, you know, you are living a very comfortable life, and also a very conventional life. You need to like shake that, because as a thinker, you need to make yourself unfamiliar to yourself. And I tell them, and that task unfortunately requires a lot of courage, and it requires a lot of humility. And if you cannot muster that level of courage or that level of humility, you will not get particularly far in this so-called quest for truth, because it requires you to go places within yourself and to go places outside of yourself that you're neither willing nor able. And a lot of my students actually get very sad because they agree that actually that they're not constitutionally made for that. And I tell them, well, I cannot really help you. Then go back to your books and teach book philosophy, because I mean, what else can I tell you? You know, I don't know what else to tell you. Either you have it within yourself or you don't have it within yourself. And so in a way, I tell them, like, in order to, that's where like the epistemology blends into like the moral, in the sense that I believe that certain epistemological virtues are actually moral virtues, and they're issues of character, so to speak. And in a way, to be a good cognizer, you need to bring in qualities that have hardly anything to do with like with knowledge. And if you don't bring those things, you will never be any good, I believe. So that's what I have to say.
Lovely. In fact, your set of reflections here are pointing to a very deeper uh, field of thinking, realizations, and your book on roti is really pointing to another, not only a book, but another zone of thinking and living, and that you are very creatively pointing to.
Sir,
So,
can I say something?
just 1 minute, Amit, just one.
Okay.
Now, there is a participant with the name My PC. So, would you please, Amir will invite you. My PC, can you tell your name? And you had a question. Would you like to say this, please? Oh, yes. Yes, Dr. Jana, your name is not visible. So, Dr. Jana teaches, in an institute in Odisha, India. He also is engaged in social service and social action. So, Dr. Jana, please.
Good evening to you all. Really, the topic is very important one, and which has dominated the fundamental sphere of the society, that is public religion. Actually, we become earlier. We were conscious since time of Socrates, where we found demagogues who became responsible to give poison to Socrates and death, responsible for death of Socrates, demagogues. And nowadays, the activities of demagogues have been turned into obscurantism. I think I think obscurantism is preventing for public reason sometimes. Yeah. Obscurantism. Those who are our speaker was talking about that, power is being manipulated, was referring to power. So actually power is in the political sphere and political persons. And in my view, not only in India, but other countries are true, then this power is concentrated obscurant persons. That means those who are diverting the people, actually they are talking that they are hermeneutic, but doing another thing, that is they are doing the work of obscurantism. I think that's the very reason for which there is no public reason. So they are preventing to create public reason. So that's the fundamental. And another thing is, we all know that for that reason there is no discussion, there is no dialogue, there is no public dialogue, there is no inclusion of public dialogue even. Nowadays also media is doing very interesting job. Media is highlighting these demagogues. Media is highlighting the demagogues, the activities of demagogues and the words and voices of the demagogues. So they are not emphasizing the people's concern, people's problem, the society's problem. And very interestingly, the public region is remembered today in 21st century when there is highlight of global issues. For example, either it is ecology, it is global justice, it is global poverty, global illiteracy, etc. So in this context, actually, we remind of what's the need of public region and why it is not there. And it is not there, or it is being prevented, in my view, it's my view, due to these obscurant persons, the demagogues. So we are expecting always social capital.
Dr. Jana, you have kindly made your point. I think it is clear. Thank you. And 1 minute, Ivan, Amir wants to add one or two lines. Then Amir, please say, and then we'll listen to Ivan, please.
Yeah, I don't have anything to say, but just that I completely agree with you, sir. We don't need more armchair philosophy or philosophers sitting inside universities. If anything, we need to rescue philosophy from universities. The problem is not philosophy itself, but what happens to it when it gets locked inside academic routines. Too much of what we see today is just abstract talk that never actually touches the ground. What we need now is something very fundamental, which you were referring to, that philosophy has really returned to everyday life. It has to, help us understand our world and act with clarity and courage, which which means that we have to question what we are doing in our daily lives, our routines, our habits, and the choices we are making without even noticing. I think real thinking or real philosophy begins there, in the moments when we stop and ask why we are doing something and whether it still fits the kind of person we hope to be. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, can I speak now, Ananta?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay, I'll start with the last commentator with Amir, and then I'll go back. The idea about academic philosophy, yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I believe that academic philosophy, certainly, in the United States, has become as bad a site for doing philosophy as it was like during like the modern period, like Descartes, Spinoza, Locke, Hume, Berkeley, Leibniz. None of those people operated within universities. Universities did not produce what we call modern philosophy. It was produced by people that were operating in the margins of what you and I will call cultural production at the time. All these people had jobs elsewhere, and they just eked out an existence outside of like the standard sites of philosophical production. The universities were full of like academic bureaucrats that were peddling a type of Thomism, and that's what philosophy became. And I believe that we are certainly in the United States in a very similar place where nothing particularly in importance or interest is happening within the confines of academic departments. In fact, in my department, I find that people are incredibly conservative in their views and cautious, but without for safeguarding such little amounts of like social power and financial remuneration. They're treated like dirt. Nobody cares about them. They get paid very, very little, and still they believe that they are that what they have is precious and they need to preserve it. And the stinginess of it is just I find that it strikes me as shocking that these people have sacrificed so much of their conscience for so little, for so little. And so I believe that system should all be dismantled. I think the humanities in the United States are going to be phased out. And I believe that I believe that the human species will just find a different place to place those energies. I don't think that those energies become extinct. Humanity produces a next generation of human beings that will have the very same impulses. So these energies will take a different shape like they took in modern times, you know? So I think this is a cyclical process, and we are in a particularly awful time for doing philosophy, I believe. So that's what I have to say about that. And with the previous um, interlocutor, I couldn't agree more about what he said. I think part of like the collapse of public discourse is a willful denial of the people that run the show to give a hearing to any views that are completely obvious but are completely against what the system is designed to do. And I find that what is shocking to me is just the audacity of these individuals that are upholding a set of perspectives that is so maladaptive, and that is so against the against like the multiplicity of facts of the matter, and that any individual that comes to question them, every single question is a conversation stopper, you know, and that they are so adamant about not engaging, and that they feel that, in a way obviously correctly from a performative point of view, that they don't feel that this type of interpellation really concerns them, you know. So the system will not accept any questioning, and the first way that they enact that principle is that they will simply ignore your question. And I spend a lot of time on social media now because it's one of the few places where I can talk to random people, you know, on a daily basis. And I find that you can hardly ever engage in any sort of like interested discussion of values with anybody, because they will simply refuse to engage with you when they realize that your values and their values are are not in alignment. But lately, what I've done, very very much recently, what I've done is that I don't care. I engage now in a type of like moral shaming, and it requires a certain type of conviction. But I now feel the conviction of telling a person, you know, what you say is just completely wrong. In the past, I would have been all like, oh, what about fallibilism? What about like the other way of looking at things? Now I just tell people what you're saying is utterly wrong and it's just rubbish. And it is an audacity that you try to pull this thing off as if these are some sort of like common sense points of view that every single human being should embrace by common sense. You know, what you are is a coward. A lot of times their response is very interesting, because either they become incredibly aggressive or they simply disappear. A lot of these people just simply stop engaging. They literally get scared, or actually they block me. And I've had a lot to think about that, because again, one of the tendencies that one has if one is self-critical and humble is that it's like, well, maybe I'm going too hard on these people. But I think that these people are like a bunch of charlatans, is what they are. And that they actually, things have gotten so bad that I feel epistemologically comfortable putting, quote unquote, putting these people in their place. So I do it. The other thing that I do with everybody that I engage in like social media that engage me, because I never engage with people unless they engage me. But if they engage me, I always call them. If their account is private, I said, make your account public, show your face. Show your face. If you want to participate in a public discussion, show your face. Show who you are. And they take it very, very, very badly. Very badly. Which shows me that what the previous interlocutor said is true. These people are living in a world that is shameful, but the levels of mediation that we have allow all these people to hide all their charlatanery. And I am just like sick of it by now. So I just try to make their life more uncomfortable rather than less uncomfortable. And I tell them, you know that this is true. And everybody knows that this is true. And you just don't want to admit that this is true. And then they just literally disappear because they know that it's true. I believe that they feel shame. And I think that if some people still feel shame, it means that they're still reachable. Because I think the problem is when an individual then cannot feel shame anymore, then you're really screwed. I think an individual like Donald Trump cannot feel any shame, and I think that's incredibly problematic. I think Benjamin Netanyahu cannot feel any shame, and that's incredibly problematic because those people are not human. No amount of like, you know, civil disobedience will work with a society that cannot feel any shame.
Well, dear Ivan, like this last sentence is a profound truth. Again, with your appreciation of Gandhi and civil disobedience, but also pointing to certain fundamental dimension of human existence, like shame, you know, and how do we, yes,
I
and
think
yes,
I
go
think
ahead.
that I think things are gonna get way, way worse before they get better, and they will require higher levels of confrontation and moral courage. And I really hope I wish everybody the best in that endeavor, because it's gonna be a very, very, very tough fight, because I think it's a spiritual fight. And everybody that is doing philosophy in a way that is actually with integrity is going to be a certain type of spiritual warrior. And the fights that we're about to be fighting are very, very big, because they're fights for the planet and fights for like the humanity of humans. The fights could not be any more fundamental, you know. I'll say one last thing. I became acquainted about a year ago with an Indian woman who was raised in like rural Punjab, and she's very young. She's like about 25 years old, but she and I really connected, and I believe that we connected because she was from rural Punjab, and she was like from the Dalit community. And I think we connected because there are different temporalities and spatialities in the world. And I think she comes from a world, so to speak, using like the word like world, from a life world that is in a way convergent with my childhood. So in a way, being raised in the Dalit community